Ocean Acidification Roundtable. We're really glad that you can join us, and we're going to start this webinar. We've got a full agenda, so I'm going to dive right in. So today's webinar, on the next slide, you'll see the title. And the next slide is coming. There we go. The title is a long one, A State-Level Policy, Management, and Science Approach to Build Support to Address Ocean Acidification. Lessons learned after over 5 years of stakeholder collaboration in Washington State. We got a great panel lined up for this, but first I want to acknowledge this is hosted by CCAN, or the California Current Acidification Network. So thanks to CCAN for hosting this. My name is Jan Newton. I'm here at the University of Washington, co-director for the Washington OA Center and director for NANOOS, our Pacific Northwest Ocean Observing System. And I'm proud to say that I've been a founding member of the CCAN Steering Committee. So it is my pleasure now to introduce our panel today, each of which is characterized by their excellence in their knowledge, but also their willingness to work across fields, disciplines, and institutions. And I think you'll see that that's made our collective ability here just that much stronger. So first up is Martha Consgard. Martha is the chair of the Marine Resource Advisory Council. She'll explain what that is, but I know Martha as a true leader. She's not daunted by crossing between science, management, policy, asking great questions all the while. And I can tell you that Martha can definitely motivate action, and she truly has. Next, we'll have Bill Dewey, the Director of Public Affairs for Taylor Shellfish Farms. And he also owns and operates his own shellfish farm in Samish Bay here in Washington State. I know Bill as a dynamic communicator. He is able to explain the shellfish industry perspective to scientists, managers, and most profoundly to decision makers from local, state, national, international audiences. Bill has brought this message so effectively to audiences diverse as the United Nations, as well as to Washington business associations here, and has done so in a very compelling fashion. Next is Kirsten Feifel, Dr. Kirsten Feifel. She is the Ocean Acidification Science and Policy Advisor for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, their Aquatics Division. Kirsten is applying her scientific knowledge as a biological oceanographer to advise the Washington DNR on the nexus between science and policy, and has already proven quite effective at this. She's well versed on the issues of OA and climate change, and able to communicate why these matter to management, but also how to work to gain the knowledge needed to do so. Next is Dr. Richard Feely. Dick, as we know him, Dick is a NOAA Senior Fellow at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Lab in Seattle. He's a highly respected international leader in the field of ocean acidification. A carbon chemist to the core, his knowledge on OA, but also his strong interest to work across fields like chemistry and biology, as well as across scales from Puget Sound to the global ocean, makes him unique, and we are so lucky that he is at a NOAA lab that is here in Washington State. Dick is truly a leader in the field of ocean acidification internationally. And last on our panel is Dr. Terry Klinger. She's a Baer Professor of Sustainability Science, Director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington, and co-director of the Washington OA Center. Terry is an award-winning ecologist who has applied her research to be relevant to management and policy. I'd say Terry has keen insight to connections and an excellent ability to draw out what the implications are from new scientific revelations. So today's format is that there will be presentations from our entire panel without questions, 1 one after the other, and then we will have time for question and answers at the end that you can write into the question box, and then we will adjourn. So more on that later. Before we start, I just wanted to briefly offer a quick introduction to what ocean acidification is. I think that everybody knows that, but just in case not, OA, as we call it, refers to chemical changes in seawater that are a result of the buildup of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, some of which the oceans absorb. The buildup of CO2 is largely to carbon emissions, and as this increasingly large amount of CO2 enters seawater, it causes chemical reactions that lower the pH and availability of carbonate ions. You'll hear various scientists, as they assess OA, discuss many variables such as pH, CO2 concentration, or the saturation state of calcium carbonate materials like aragonite or calcite. But just remember, high CO2 begets low pH or low aragonite saturation states. So several years ago in Washington State, OA ceased being just a scientific research topic and became a very real condition to a much wider audience. And to tell that story and how our state was affected and responded, let's hear from Martha. How did this start and what the heck is MRAC?
Thank you very much, Jan. As said, I'm the chair of the Marine Resources Advisory Council, and I'm going to walk you through how we, the MRAC, if you don't mind me calling it that from here on out, came into being and the role we play in Washington State and beyond. And I'm guiding this, and there we are. Let me just say the obvious, that a healthy ocean is essential to all life on Earth. A healthy ocean underpins the world's economic, political, and cultural systems, and the foundation for successful and stable societies around the globe. As Jan said, it plays a central role in regulating the climate and absorbing human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. And we had a problem here in the Pacific Northwest, which many of you are familiar with. Between 2005 and 2009, Washington State started to experience some of the earliest and direct impacts of ocean acidification. Over a decade ago, Taylor Shellfish, who you'll hear more from through the mouth of Bill Dewey right after me, the biggest shellfish company in our state and one of the largest in the country, saw massive oyster larvae die-offs that killed most of the entire seed crop for those years. At about that same time, scientists discovered that Washington, unfortunately, and I'm not bragging here, was ground zero on Earth for major changes in our ocean's chemistry, which was caused, as Jan said, by increased absorption of carbon into the ocean. Ocean acidification was here, and we needed to act immediately to protect the shellfish industry, one of our strongest rural coastal employers, and it's really an icon of our cultural heritage. In response, the shellfish industry initially reached out to Senator Maria Cantwell and Governor Christine Gregoire for help. Senator Cantwell responded by finding some 2009 federal stimulus package funds to study the problem within the shellfish growers' hatcheries, and they did this by deploying pH and PCO2 sensors, thinking that maybe that was the problem. And in response as well, Governor Gregoire and the state legislature went to action and did three major things. One was in 2012, created the Washington Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification, which I'll describe at more length in a minute. In 2013, the legislature created the Washington Ocean Acidification Center at the University of Washington. And in 2013, the Marine Resources Advisory Council was created to ensure Washington State addressed ocean acidification in a strategic and a comprehensive way. So our basics are that we act per the legislation as a state body to maintain a sustainable coordination and focus on ocean acidification. Our members include legislative, executive, and elected officials, the nonprofit sector, and most importantly, and Bill will stress this more, the private sector, private industry. Participation also comes, as you've heard, from the academic institutions, and our federal brothers and sisters are hugely important to our work. We meet more or less quarterly as a body, and here's a list of the people who are involved, and you can see they make up the types of people I just described. So what we do more granularly is and this is in our legislation, we ensure that ocean acidification work is efficient, prioritized, leveraged, and most importantly, maybe integrated into key programs across the state. We coordinate with the Washington OA Center to ensure that science is absolutely at the heart of everything we do. We deliver recommendations to the governor and the legislature on OA and changing ocean chemistry more broadly, at least once a year. We have workshops with the legislature's relevant committees once a year as well to keep them up to speed. We have found it extremely important and have found multiple venues to seek public and private funding to support the recommendations. And we partake in a myriad of OA outreach activities as well. Our guiding strategy was created in 2012 and is in a product called the Blue Ribbon Panel Report on Ocean Acidification, From Knowledge to Action. It's the comprehensive strategy for addressing ocean acidification in Washington State. It is the first of its kind, and out of it came 42 actions across 6 focus areas, and let me tell you about them. The first one, quite obviously, is the need to reduce carbon emissions. The second is our work is based around reducing local land-based contributions to ocean acidification, understanding that better and understanding what we can do to mitigate that. The third area is increasing our ability to adapt to and remediate the impacts of ocean acidification. The fourth is investing in monitoring and investigations. The fifth, informing, educating, and engaging stakeholders, the public, and decision makers, as said. And the sixth is just maintaining the drumbeat, a sustainable and coordinated focus on ocean acidification. In 2017, the Marine Resource Advisory Council led its partners in evaluating and updating the Washington State Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification comprehensive strategy. It had been 5 years, and we thought it was time to look back. We released this in December, received a lot of media attention intentionally, and in it we synthesized the latest scientific understandings developed over the last 5 years. We documented the progress that our collaborative efforts have achieved across our many, many partners, leveraging state and private funds and telling those stories. We identified key priorities to focus on for the next 5 years, and we renewed loudly Washington's commitment to maintaining strategic momentum in addressing the ongoing threat from changing ocean chemistry. If you're interested in looking at any of these reports, you could go and find them online at oainwa.org, oainwa.org. So, you know, not through through all of this work, we have emerged as a recognized leader on the regional, national, and global stages. The Blue Ribbon Panel, as some of you may know, because you may have been inspired by it, but inspired other coastal states to develop similar action plans in Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, California, and Oregon. Our plan has been held up as an example not only across the country, but across the globe as an example of how to move from problem to solution, from policy to action. And as you'll hear from Bill Dewey next, the key ingredient there was to have industry at the table asking the questions. But the key partners that played a central role in elevating the problem to national and international arenas have certainly been our state governor's office. Governor Inslee is a climate champion, and his office, along with the offices of the governors of Washington, Oregon, and the premier of DC in the Pacific Coast Collaborative, has elevated the West Coast as leaders in this work. Out of that work has come an institution called the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification, where we have shown up at the UN, at national and international ocean summits, and at the COPs in Paris, Bonn, and Marrakesh to try to elevate the issue of ocean acidification in climate agreements. Our success has been built on a strong foundation of collaboration and really essential relationships by many different parties: the seafood industry, tribes, policymakers, scientists, and educators. So what's next, finally? Our overarching priorities include this list that you're seeing here: to continue with biological investigations to understand that better, to bolster our efforts to reduce local nutrient sources, to build on our already fulsome monitoring efforts, to build additional adaptation tools like kelp cultivation and restoration, which you'll hear more from Dr. Feifel, and to support statewide carbon reduction efforts, which are certainly at the core of our work, and other needs identified in Natural Resource Managers survey that we have just created. We're currently engaging our members in developing budget priorities for the 2019-21 biennium. And I think with that, I'll stop and I'll turn this over to Bill Dewey to talk more in depth about the industry's perspective and their role that they played so importantly in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. So yes, next we turn to Bill. Bill, could you please share your perspective on this story from the shellfish industry and what your experience has been?
Yeah, I sure will. Thanks, Martha and Jan. So I'll touch on what the impacts have been to the industry here on the West Coast. Martha's pretty well covered the policy maker response, but I might touch on that just a bit, and then the collaboration between the industry and policymakers and scientists, both at the government and academic level, to give people an understanding of kind of where we're at today. So Shalyn, I'm not seeing a slide advance here on my slides, so maybe you can do it for me next. So this is just the main products that are grown here on the West Coast. And really the biggest impacts we've seen to date have been largely on Pacific oysters, and to a lesser extent for the industry on the mussels as well. I'll touch on that. I'll go through some slides of just showing the farms here so people can get a perspective of what we do that may not be familiar with it. Jan mentioned in the introduction that I have a shellfish farm of my own that I do on the side. Besides the work I do for Taylor's, this is my farm, and I include the slide just to demonstrate that I've got a personal dog in the fight, as well as the work I do for Taylor's. In fact, this is where I'm at today, getting ready to go out with the crew to plant some seed on my farm this afternoon. So next slide. Just bottom cultured oysters for shucked oyster meat production. This is the tradition of the West Coast industry. It's been done like this for nearly a century, and really the foundation of the industry. Next slide. We do off bottom culture with those same clusters in muddy areas to produce shucked oyster meats. Next slide. Just the oyster shucking process. This video is a little bit glitchy here, but it's kind of fun to watch when it works real time, because it looks like it's actually been sped up in a time lapse. But the folks that chuck oysters get pretty darn good at it. Next. And then those meats get washed and graded and packed into various sized containers for shipment to markets around the world. Single oyster culture, a different process to produce oysters for the half shell trade, a real trend in the industry currently. Next. And then more of those single oyster cultures. This is a new method that's being used by a number of companies, Taylor's included, to produce a real premium half shell oyster. Next. And the mussel culture is all suspended from rafts here in the Northwest. This is our farm in Taunton Inlet, one of our farms in Taunton Inlet. Next. And finally, the geoduck culture, which is a more recent species that's been farmed by the industry since the mid-1990s. Next. So click a couple more times, thanks. This is, I'm sure others are going to touch on this behind me, but really demonstrates the importance of the changes that are happening for the shellfish industry. So as that carbon dioxide has been absorbed by the seawater, it's changing the chemistry, it's increasing the CO2 concentration, increasing the acidity, and what we've learned is more significantly for us is it's reducing the availability of carbonate ions. So since the beginning of the industrial era, we've decreased those carbonate ions by about 16%. By the end of the century, they estimate that'll be by 50%. And we see these levels today, the levels that are predicted for the end of the century, we see with upwelling events today. And that has explained why we're seeing the production problem with our oyster seed in particular. Next. So as Jan or Martha alluded to earlier, the biggest impact for our industry, or where this all came to light, was back in 2008, 2009, when our oyster seed production was off by about 75% in our hatchery and in the Whiskey Creek hatchery on the Oregon coast, two of the major producers of seed for the West Coast. At the same time, natural sets were failing out in Willapa Bay, and we had a seed crisis on the West Coast here, where shellfish growers couldn't get oyster seed to plant on their farms. And it drew the attention of policymakers, both Governor Gregoire at the time, as well as members of Congress, Senator Cantwell in particular, because these are really important jobs in the rural areas. You know, the industry generates about a couple $100 million a year in economic activity and employs roughly 3,000 people in direct and induced jobs. And those are, you know, those don't sound like big numbers in the grander scheme of the economy, but in rural areas, they're key jobs. Pacific County, for example, on the Washington coast, it's the #1 private employer. Mason County in southern Puget Sound, second largest private employer. So it's a big deal that these farms weren't able to get seed, and the policymaker response was significant and really appreciated by the industry. Next. So just to demonstrate what happens to those oyster larvae, and this has come again from a great collaboration between our industry scientists, university scientists, and NOAA scientists to help make this picture come into focus for us. But this is a scanning electron microscope image of day-old oyster larvae from our hatchery on the Hood Canal. On the left, one that's been reared with adequate carbonate ions available to build its shell, and on the right, inadequate carbonate ions. And you can see how the shell is deformed. In the first 48 hours of life, after that egg's fertilized, it's got to do two things. It's got to build a shell to protect itself and a feeding organ to feed and swim with to get more energy. And when there aren't enough carbonate ions available, it uses all that energy stored in the egg trying to build that shell, and then fails to build the feeding organ, and it dies. And go on to the next slide. You can see that here the feeding organ called a velum that it swims and feeds with. And so if it can't develop that, you can see from this video, you know, that's a critical organ, and why the animal doesn't survive past that if it doesn't develop that velum. Next. So the industry's response initially obviously was panic, as Dick Feely was our keynote speaker back in 2008 at our growers conference, and presented information on ocean acidification, and that this is what he thought might be impacting our seed production. Pretty dire news, obviously not something we can directly impact to try to fix the problem. But we responded initially by ramping up monitoring and research with this collaboration with the universities and NOAA. We learned initially how to monitor that water and dodge the corrosive events, and now we're to the point where we actually monitor and treat real time to increase the carbonate ions in the water to recover our seed production, which has been a very effective response. Working on breeding OA-resistant oysters, expanded production in Hawaii. Both our company and others have hatcheries there that have not been impacted. It's a different oceanography there, and we haven't seen the effects, so that's been a saving grace for us to have facilities there. And then looking to research the DNR has been helping with, and others, co-culturing in seagrass and seaweed, where that carbon dioxide is being sucked up by the plants and creating a refuge for the oysters. So looking down the road as conditions get worse, and we anticipate it'll impact our juveniles and adults on our farms where we can't alter the chemistry with adding sodium carbonate like we do in the hatchery. We need other ways to do that. So next. Also, less talked about publicly, but equally concerning, is research that's been done by Emily Carrington and her group at Friday Harbor Labs on the impacts on mussels. And what they found is, in a higher CO2 warmer ocean, the mussels have weaker byssal threads and thinner shells. So sloughing from our raft culture is already an issue for us, and that's going to get worse, it appears. Next. This is an issue that has garnered an inordinate amount of media attention with the impact to the shellfish industry, and I personally can't explain it. It's been quite amazing, considering really in the grander scheme how small our industry is. But I guess it's because it's jobs and it's food that people can relate to that it has really drawn a lot of attention, both from the media and from policymakers. Next. And Martha touched on this already, but the policymaker response has been truly outstanding on the West Coast, starting with the Blue Ribbon Panel and now MRAC, and the model that's been for both other states as well as other countries around the world has been most impressive. Next. As we have time, we're trying to use this example, since our story does seem to resonate, and we get invited to speak in a variety of different forms. We try to get out there and do that and use our story to change carbon policies. I've had opportunities here to speak to some very interesting and important audiences. Next. Wanted to mention also the formation of a new group I've been involved with. It was the inspiration of a Maine oyster grower that's been impacted by ocean acidification. Working in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, we launched last fall the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. And basically this is a group of growers from around the country that are trying to use this story and our experience and the impacts on our businesses to inform our customers and inform policymakers, and use that experience to try to change carbon policy. Next. So there's just my contact information, and I'm not sure how I did on time there, Jan, but I'll pass the baton on to next speaker here.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill and Martha, for the setup. This is Kirsten Feifel, and I'm going to provide you with a quick overview of how the work completed by many partners throughout Washington State has helped to advance our knowledge about ocean acidification, and how this knowledge is really helping us to identify opportunities to enhance our resilience to impending future changes. Next slide. So continuing with the theme of using the update of the Washington State Blue Ribbon Panel report to help serve as a backbone, I want to show how we are linking our work with the key actions identified in this report. And you can see those key actions are indicated by the blue bubble on my slides in the left-hand corner. Like others have said, this report and the actions therein reflects countless meetings, phone calls, and the work of multiple ad hoc groups coming together to share their ideas and management questions on how to prepare for ocean acidification. Really, the process of developing this report has solidified relationships across diverse partners and has proven to be an effective tool to help clearly link research to management and policy needs. The most recent addendum, we've increased our actions to 57 suggested actions, and here I'm going to highlight a few of those. Next slide. So one of the goals for Washington is to identify ways to increase our ability to adapt and or remediate the impacts of ocean acidification. One of the key early actions that was identified in the Blue Ribbon Panel report was to investigate the role aquatic vegetation like kelp and seagrass can play in helping to improve local water chemistry conditions. This is the work that Bill was referring to earlier. Kelp and seagrass, much like terrestrial plants, take in CO2 from their surrounding water to help them produce energy via photosynthesis. This may locally improve pH conditions. I'm going to highlight two projects that have been underway here in Washington State to investigate this question. First, the Department of Natural Resources has established multiple long-term monitoring sites termed the Acidification Nearshore Monitoring Network, or NANOOS for short. These are sensors placed inside and outside seagrass beds throughout the Puget Sound and along the coast. Early results from this research suggest that seagrass can measurably increase pH during the daytime in nearshore environments. Even more exciting, new research is suggesting that the Pacific and Olympia oysters actually might grow 20 to 25% faster inside seagrass beds relative to outside of them. The second project that I'm going to highlight is a consortium of researchers from the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. UW, NOAA, and DNR launched a 5-year project funded in part by the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation to investigate the power of kelp to improve water chemistry. As you can see in the pictures on the right of this slide, they are culturing sugar kelp at a 2.5-acre site in Hood Canal and assessing the effects of kelp cultivation on pH, nitrogen removal, and biology. 2017 was actually the first year of full-scale cultivation and harvest, and the associated data are currently being analyzed. Next slide. While we continue to investigate adaptation options such as seagrass and kelp installments, it is vital and recognized in the Blue Ribbon Panel report that we simultaneously continue to support species restoration and protection efforts. The healthier and more diverse the Puget Sound and coast ecosystems can be, the more resilient we expect it to be to the stresses imposed by ocean acidification and other changing ocean conditions. Aside from the potential ocean acidification benefits, healthy kelp and seagrass habitats provide sanctuary for marine life, including key life stages of commercially important fisheries. Unfortunately, in some locations across Washington, kelp populations appear to be declining. To help address this concern, the Northwest Straits Initiative and partners are developing a kelp recovery plan for the Puget Sound, and we're also working on learning how to optimize kelp restoration techniques. Similarly, since 2000, DNR, alongside many partners, has monitored eelgrass populations throughout the Puget Sound. Currently, we estimate that eelgrass covers about 22,000 hectares, which is great news given the potential for it to improve water chemistry and the habitat that eelgrass provides to countless organisms. It is vital that we protect the eelgrass, and we have to work to restore eelgrass in key locations where it is currently absent. To date, we have transplanted nearly 100 sites throughout the Puget Sound and continue to modify methods to improve transplant success and reduce costs. Next slide. Another strategy to enhance resilience and improve habitat conditions is to support the restoration of native species, such as the Olympia oyster. Emerging research is suggesting that the native Olympia oyster may be less susceptible to the impacts of ocean acidification. This may be because this species is evolutionarily adapted to survive in the lower pH waters experienced in an upwelling zone, such as the coast of Washington. Supporting efforts to restore this species is an important strategy to help diversify habitat structure and keep Washington's waters productive and diverse. As such, several restoration efforts are underway, including restoring 60 acres of native oyster habitat. To support the restoration of native species, we're fortunate to have the Kenneth K. Chu Center for Shellfish Research and Restoration. It was established here in 2014. This facility provides a unique opportunity for researchers and managers to learn about how to restore native species, including kelp, pinto abalone, rock scallops, sea cucumbers, and the Olympia oyster. Next slide. And from a management perspective, and it's clearly important, it is of utmost importance that we understand the causes and really the seasonal signatures of ocean acidification. Investing and supporting our capacity to monitor how ocean acidification is progressing in our waters is central to the work we do in Washington State. We are very fortunate to have multiple partners from NOAA, state agencies, and the Washington OA Center itself that collectively are helping us to understand how carbonate chemistry can vary both in space and time across Washington's waters. Samples and data are collected from ships, planes, buoys, and in the nearshore environment. As we begin to better understand the patchwork signatures of ocean acidification, we are discovering that the complexity within the system might afford us opportunities to develop place-based adaptation and management strategies. For example, research has shown that different basins within Puget Sound have slightly different carbonate chemistry signatures. As we better understand the sources of variability, we might be able to identify candidate refuge locations to take advantage of the fact that some locations are relatively more buffered from OA impacts compared to other locations. Next slide. We are also taking that field data and using them to calibrate computer models that help us understand, among many things, factors that contribute to ocean acidification. Here in Washington, we have models that have been developed to address specific questions such as, how does upwelling affect the pHs experienced along Washington's coast? Does land-based pollution contribute to ocean acidification in specific embayments? And some models are even being used to provide short-term forecasts that are used to inform day-to-day decisions at shellfish farms. One of these models suggests that nutrient input from land-based sources may influence local water chemistry. So as Martha mentioned, the Department of Ecology has launched the Puget Sound Nutrient Source Reduction Program to help develop strategies that will reduce the impacts nutrients have on our local waters. Next slide. And central to all of this has been that we need continual and regular coordination and communication, and that has been key throughout this process and remains central to our success because as we learn more, our priorities and next steps can shift over time. In an effort to be continually responsive and adaptive to managers' needs, DNR and the Department of Fish and Wildlife recently partnered with students at the University of Washington and developed a survey to solicit resource managers' concerns related to changing ocean conditions. We took a two-phase approach, first holding informational interviews with 27 state and tribal resource managers. We then used the responses from the interviews to help populate an online survey with a total of 13 questions. This survey was then taken by 92 individuals across the state. We were fortunate to get a diverse respondents ranging from commercial fishermen, the aquaculture industry, scientists, and state and tribal resource managers. Our goals for this project are many, but key. They are to identify the concerns and information needs regarding changing ocean conditions, to inform future priorities based on management and policy implications, improve linkages and coordination among partners, and lastly, to use these results to inform our work in Washington. Next slide. We're currently analyzing the data from the online survey. The survey just closed about a month ago, and we do plan to have a written report later this summer. But I did want to show some preliminary results. And so what I'm showing here is an example of the type of information we were able to gather from respondents. Survey respondents were given 15 things that we heard as needs during the informational interview, and were asked to select their top 5 priorities. While you can see there is a large spread across the 15 priorities, the bottom 3 on this bar graph, map or summary of most vulnerable habitats, increased monitoring in nearshore environments, and biological responses of species to changing ocean conditions, were selected by at least half of all the respondents that took this survey. So we plan to continue to process the survey results and pull out relevant quotes from the interviews, and our hope is that we can use this information to further link research efforts directly to the needs of resource managers. Next slide. And lastly, I wanted to highlight that Washington has been a committed partner to others and is coordinating with both regional and international OA efforts. Here, I'm showing a map of the upcoming OAH inventory that has been worked on by representatives from California, Oregon, Washington, BC, and Alaska. This inventory will be key and will help managers be more aware of what types of monitoring assets are out there and where they are located. In turn, we can also use this inventory and compare it with management concerns and needs to help us identify where the monitoring gaps exist relative to managers' perspectives. Next slide. So I wanted to say thanks and for allowing me to give you a whirlwind tour of Washington's work. I hope that I provided you with some examples of how research is being used in Washington State and really how we're focused on translating the science into actions. I want to give my utmost thanks to the many partners involved in this work, including the Washington OA Center and the leadership provided by Martha. You are what has made this storyline a reality. So thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten, very much. Okay, shifting to Dick. Dick, what can you tell us about the science, the recent results? What are we learning?
Okay, thank you, Jan, and thank you, Kirsten, for that lovely introduction to our research. So what we have been doing is working very closely with the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Ecology, University of Washington, NOAA, on the outer regions, the parks and the sanctuary groups to develop an integrated observational network for ocean acidification. And as Kirsten said, we use survey cruises, moorings, and various observational activities that involve chemical and biological and physical observations together. On this map, you see the distribution of our observing sites with the inset showing everything that we have been doing collectively as a group in Washington area. On the right-hand panel, I've shown some recent work by Francisco Chavez that shows the variability that we see in our coastal waters in blue for PCO2, for example, and in black you can see what it is in the open ocean at the Mauna Loa site. We have much higher variability, which means we have to have longer term records. But when we have such long-term records, we're able to discern the long-term climate trends, both in PCO2 and pH. And what we have discovered, again, you can see the long-term pH trend in the bottom panel, is that the acidification in our coastal waters is a little faster than we see in the open ocean waters. This is due to the combined impacts of the uptake of anthropogenic carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, plus the additional impacts that we have from nutrient sources, changes in upwelling rates, and other sources of carbon and acidification sources. So we get a slightly faster acidification in our region than we do in the open ocean. Next slide, please. And what we have been able to do is to take all that data and determine the concentration of anthropogenic carbon dioxide in our coastal waters. And this is a map of the concentration of human-generated carbon dioxide along our coast from Vancouver Island all the way down to Baja California in surface waters and at 50 meters. And we have been able to show that, in fact, there is a north-south trend in surface waters, a little higher concentrations farther south that we go, a little bit lower to the north. But the range is fairly tight, between about 54 and 66 micromoles per kilogram in surface waters. And when you look in the at 50 meters of subsurface waters, you do see the impact of the upwelling, because when you have upwelling, you have older water with lower anthropogenic CO2 being upwelled, and you can see that signal right along the coast. In this case, you see very clearly from middle of Oregon all the way to the middle of California. And that mixing of that lower anthropogenic CO2 water with the water from the surface cause these upwelling signals we see along the coast. They are still quite significant, very significant concentrations of anthropogenic CO2, but that upwelling signal is very clear. Next slide, please. This is a very nice time series that we have along our coast, because we have done enough surveys, and so you can actually see the buildup of anthropogenic CO2. On the left-hand side is California, on the right-hand side is Vancouver Island. You can see a little higher surface water concentrations building up to the south than to the north. But the most important thing to see in this slide is that the penetration of the anthropogenic CO2 is down to about 500 meters in the south and as deep as about 800 meters to the north, which means that along our shelf, where there is upwelling on the continental shelf, we are actually bringing in anthropogenic CO2 from other sources along the bottom, in addition to the anthropogenic CO2 that is exchanged across the air-sea interface. And that results in a significant decline in the aragonite saturation state, which is shown on that right-hand panel. And what we have seen is a decline of aragonite saturation about 0.5 units since the beginning of the industrial area. Next slide, please. So what we can do is to look at how that corrosive waters, the waters that have a saturation state less than 1, how close they approach the surface in our region. So this is a plot of the aragonite saturation depth as it was in 2007. during our first cruise, and as it is on the left-hand panel, as a result of our work in 2016. And what you find is that because of the uptake of the anthropogenic CO2, we're seeing a shoaling of the aragonite saturation horizon. It's on the order of about 1 to 2 meters per year, but it is really quite shallow in the Washington, Oregon region. Generally speaking, near the coast, it's anywhere from 20 to 40 meters below the surface. So it's at a depth that's going to infect many of our shellfish organisms. And during a strong upwelling or strong mixing, this corrosive waters reaches right to the surface. Next slide, please. So what we have done is we've strategically deployed our moorings. These are the NANOOS moorings that Jan leads, and we put our CO2 and pH sensors right on the NANOOS moorings, both on the coast and at Deba and Toano. And we can then make comparisons of how the changing chemistry occurs offshore versus in our coastal waters. Next slide, please. And this is a wonderful representation produced by Simone Allen of a comparison of the results that we have for the offshore, which is the panels on the left at Cheba and Cape Elizabeth, versus the Puget Sound, Deba, and Toano on the right-hand side. And the lighter colors are the earlier measurements, and the darker colors are the later measurements. So what you can see from these plots is there is a significant progression, an increase in atmospheric CO2 with time from 2006 to 2016. So we've seen the buildup of that atmospheric CO2. And when we look at the seawater concentration in lower patterns, we see a distinct pattern of uptake of carbon dioxide in the summertime, and a lot of variability in the summertime in the offshore waters. In fact, most of the variability in the offshore waters is during the summertime, and that's due to that upwelling signal that we see that occurs mostly in the spring and summertime. But when we look over in Deba Bay and Toano, we see a different pattern, much more variability in the atmospheric CO2. And it turns out that the wintertime variability is much higher than the summertime. And this is due to the fact that in our Puget Sound region, the severe storms occur in the wintertime. There's strong mixing from below, and so we have much more variability, with very high variability in the wintertime than we do in the summertime. So we have opposite patterns in our data sets, and it's really by the observations we can establish these patterns and how they work. Next slide,
Dick,
please.
we're running out of time, so I'm afraid I don't think we have time for this slide so that Terry can get her talk in, and we have some time for questions. So if I could ask you to just wrap up or yield the floor. I'm worried about the time.
I'll yield the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Dick. Terry, we'd like to hear from you about what the biology is saying, is what effects we're seeing.
Sure, thanks everybody for your contributions so far. I am mindful of time, and I don't and I won't go into any gory detail about the results that I'm gonna sort of briefly present. I've left references on the slides, and you can consult those references, or you're free to contact me if you want additional information. I want to emphasize just a few points that I think are very important with respect to biology, ecology, and then the response of managers to this pervasive and growing problem. So first of all, biological effects are known to occur across virtually all life processes, across multiple trophic levels, and across multiple habitats. A few good examples of this have been given in reviews by Christy Croker and Ryan Hay and Jen Sunday, and there are others that you can find. So we know this, the effects are pervasive. Moreover, the responses are mediated via diverse physiological pathways. So there's not just one response, there's not just one type of response. There's a diversity of responses that come from sort of different organismal processes, and that increases the complexity that managers must face and must deal with. Okay, so as examples, and these are just a few examples, and I'm not going to talk about oysters or pteropods because I think most people know those stories. Among other calcifiers, we know that the energetic demands increase under conditions of ocean acidification. That means organisms spend more energy to do the same functions. Calcification rates generally decline. Shells are thinner, tend to be more vulnerable to predation, to crushing, those sorts of things. And there's really good evidence for all of these responses. Okay, among the chitinous species, so remember chitinous species are those that aren't truly calcified, but chitinous species do incorporate some calcium carbonate in their shells. Chitinous species include many plankton species, but also things like crab and shrimp. So among the chitinous species, mortality is known to increase among Dungeness crab larvae and juveniles, and larval development and survival are reduced in krill. So there's good evidence for this. The evidence from krill, interestingly enough, shows that krill are negatively impacted even at contemporary levels of ocean acidification in Puget Sound. And then very interestingly, among fish species, we know now that predator detection is affected, and here we mean negatively affected, in juvenile coho salmon, that critical life history and behavioral traits are affected in pink salmon, and that behavioral changes are exhibited by copper rockfish. There's also good evidence from the East Coast, and I haven't included East Coast species in my discussion here, but there's intriguing evidence from the East Coast that forage fish species are also negatively impacted by ocean acidification, and that's work that deserves to be replicated on the West Coast. So next slide, please. Okay, surprising to me as an ecologist are some of the things we're seeing, and I will just call out one, and that's that harmful algal species can grow more quickly and produce more toxin per cell under conditions of ocean acidification. These responses are observed among both diatom and dinoflagellate taxa. That's really surprising because diatoms and dinoflagellates don't share a very close evolutionary history, but they're both responding in a similar manner. That is also of, I think, grave concern to shellfish growers and to public health officials. If harmful algal blooms become more toxic, that will affect human populations. We know that synergistic interactions occur with other climate stressors. So chief among these are increasing temperature and declining oxygen. Think of a world in which temperature increases, so the metabolic demands of an organism increase as temperature goes up. But oxygen is declining, so they might not have sufficient oxygen, and their energetic requirements based on ocean acidification are also increasing. That's kind of a recipe for poor performance or even mortality. With respect to management, these complexities will influence management options and alternatives. This is a complicated situation. There's not one management solution. There will have to be many management solutions, and they're going to have to be innovative in some cases. So next slide, please. So my take-home message is this, that management responses require enforcement of existing regulations. We know that examples might include the Clean Water Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, certain land use practices, and so on. So enforcement of existing regulations is, the first and best place to start. I think also that holistic sort of systems-based approaches offer a means of addressing the complexity that's inherent in this problem. So for example, the turn towards ecosystem-based fisheries management is an example of systems-based thinking. There are others, certainly, that we could use as examples, but I think we're going to have to really begin to think holistically about these problems and not approach them as isolated problems in independent sectors. And then finally, I think, and this is the hardest place, creative, interdisciplinary, and cross-sectoral approaches will be required to address the rapid ocean changes that we are faced with in the coming decades. We need creative thinking around these problems. Business as usual in terms of management will help us enormously. It's absolutely necessary, but it may not be sufficient to actually fully address the consequences of ocean acidification. And I will leave it there.
Thanks so much, Terry. Very wise words. Okay, everyone, we've gone a little long, but we really want to entertain your questions. And I know that the panel can stay on after. So if you type your questions into the question box, hopefully you can see that. I don't see any questions yet. So while some questions are coming in, I really want to thank Shallon Bush of NOAA, who has organized this webinar behind the scenes, and also Terry King of Washington Sea Grant, the CCAN chair, who also helped formulate this, and also Liz Bonza of Resource Media, who worked with the panel to get us all on cue. So since I don't see any questions, Dick, I'm going to ask you. Oh, wait, there is one, and I can't read it because the thing is too tiny. How do you determine if carbon is anthropogenically sourced? Dick, that's a great question for you.
Yes, it's a wonderful question. What we have the ability to do is determine all the processes that occur both chemically, biologically, and physically. And when we do that, we then look for what is left over as we do repeat cruises, starting, in this case, from 2007 to 2016. And what is left over is that residual carbon that has to be due to anthropogenic CO2. We then integrate that through the water column, determine the total amount of anthropogenic CO2 that's penetrated into the water column.
Thanks so much, Dick. Okay, here's another one. I work with a group of folks who are out on the beach working and talking with the public, and based on what we've covered today, what are the two main takeaways you would like the public to know about ocean acidification? That's one that's suitable for several of you. Terry, I'm going to start with you, and then maybe ask Martha what you'd like to chime in with.
You know, I would say the major takeaway is one that we did not discuss, and that is that anthropogenic carbon is the primary source of ocean acidification, and that is consequently the primary remedy for ocean acidification. That's a very long-term approach, but we need to start yesterday.
Martha, anything to add?
You know, I was going to say the same thing, that, you know, we can do all of these things and we're being smart, but that's where the action is, and we got to get serious about it.
Yeah, and I would just, as a moderator's prerogative, I would add to that, you know, helping people to see how the atmosphere and the ocean communicate with each other. And so what we humans are doing in the atmosphere does wind up in the ocean, and that does undergo the chemical reactions that then do influence the biology. So the thing I always like to help is for people to see connections. Bill, what would you like to, how would you answer that question?
Well, I'm not sure I'd have anything to add over what's been said. You know, one of the things that I've been critical of MRAC and the Blue Ribbon panel is lack of direction for individuals and what they can do. You know, so if you're out with people on the beach and you're teaching them about the marine organisms and ocean acidification, you know, what behavioral changes can they make that will influence, their own carbon footprint to try to help address the problems.
Kirsten, anything to add? And then I'm going to ask Dick if he would like to add something and maybe talk about that final slide that you didn't get a chance to.
No, I think I agree with Terry, Martha, and Bill that ocean acidification, really the core of the problem is CO2 emissions. So anything that can be done at the individual level to reduce your carbon footprint is part of the solution.
Great. Okay, Dick, over to you.
Can you switch, Shallon, to that slide that I was just about to talk about? Because it really addresses both questions. Shallon?
Dick, if you could just start to wing it, and then Shallon, I don't know if you can back the slides up to the last slide of Dick's, but Dick, I think we're just going to have to jump in.
Okay, so what I wanted to say, this is slide one more back, yeah. It's a very important slide because what shows is the trends that we have seen in pH and PCO over time in the Sailor Sea. The left-hand pattern is for pH and the middle one is for PCO2. And what you can see is that we're in an accelerating trend. Is if we add more and more CO2, we're now beginning to see larger and larger changes in pH and PCO2, which means that not only do you have an absolute change, a lowering of the pH or increase of the PCO2, but the variability, the difference between the minimum on the bottom and the maximum top is increasing. So the variability is increasing, but we will continue to see that occur at an increasing rate from now through the middle of this century. So we are just at the cusp of seeing major changes taking place, and we will see much more variability and much higher changes in the next few decades. And this is something we can actually see in our observational data. It's also something we can expect to see as very significant results, particularly when we pass some of the critical thresholds for these organisms sooner rather than later. So I think it really expresses to us the concern we all have as scientists of why we really do need to work on reducing carbon dioxide emissions as soon as possible. Otherwise, we'll see much worse conditions in our area.
Thanks so much, Dick. And Shallon, if you could click to the next slide. Yes, these 6 things we know about ocean acidification in the Pacific Northwest that Dick was going to summarize, I want to call people's attention to the URL at the bottom. These 6 items are available from the website, but with a lot of explanatory text and references from the primary literature. So if there's any one of these 6 that you'd like to follow up more on, there are scientific references that you can click on and download and see from the literature, as well as some explanatory text, kind of in a Wikipedia mode that explains all 6 of these. So I know that we're past 2 o'clock, and so I want to draw the official aspect of this webinar to a close. There will be a video archive of this webinar available on the CCAN website. You can see the URL there. And Diane Pleschner-Steele has done a lot of work for CCAN and helps to maintain that website. So contact her if you have questions. And our final slide says that we're going to take a summer vacation. The roundtable will resume in the fall of 2018. And if you have an idea for a discussion topic, please let us know. Registration and more information will be distributed by the CCAN listserv. And if you're not a part of that, you can sign up through CCAN. I also want to call attention to the great NOAA acidification information exchange. And if you're not involved with that, just search for that and you'll be directed where you can sign up. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. Oh, here's one more. And as I said, the panelists are willing to stay until 2:15. It's 2:05 right now. Okay, so what do you think is important for agency level scientists and natural resource managers to focus on to be able to address these issues more effectively? Okay, what do you think is important for agency level scientists and natural resource managers to focus on to be able to address these issues more effectively? Kirsten, let's start with you.
Great, thanks. I think what I've learned in talking to folks is one of the most effective things that we can do in the agency is to reach out to partners, both internal and external, and talk about the resources and different monitoring assets that you have, talk about what you're seeing, and learn from others about what other resources are out there. I think one of the things that is really exciting right now is that the more we talk with each other and the more we learn, the more opportunities that we find. And so I would encourage folks to talk within their network and find new networks to integrate themselves in.
Great. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. That's a great answer, Kirsten.
This is Terry.
Terry, please.
Well, I will just add that I agree with Kirsten, and I think that reaching out really broadly is important. So in Washington State, for instance, the Washington Department of Health has been really involved in much of the work around ocean acidification because of the health implications. So I think broadly, think beyond your typical network, and work with colleagues across agencies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I just really want to add that from my perspective, that's one of the silver lining aspects of this horrible problem that we have, which is ocean acidification, but that it has brought the diversity of players together, working together across institutional boundaries, across disciplines, and you've really seen that and heard that from the panelists today. And there's really strength in that synergy. So it is really important. Okay, it doesn't look to me like we have any additional questions. And oops, here it is. Oh, no. Let's see. No, that is those are the ones we have. And so I would really like to thank the panelists for your effort in putting together your talks and your willingness to tell us your perspectives. And I would like to thank everybody who called in, and thanks for bearing with as we went over time, but really hope that you appreciated all of this information that came to you. All right, thank you, CCAN. Bye now.